Welcome to the Wanderer's History Podcast, and to a new episode of the current series where we go back into the world of the 16th century Mediterranean, seen through the lenses of accounts of travelers compiled in many sources such as Excerpta Cypria, the one that we're on now. Before we continue, I'd like to remind you to please hit that subscribe button if you haven't done so already. It really does help the channel a lot. Today, we look at the account or personal narrative of one Fabriano Falchetti. Falchetti was taken prisoner at the fall of Nicosia in 1570. So here we are already talking about the nearing end of Venetian rule over Cyprus, when the Ottomans, at the orders of Sultan Selim II, had launched a full-scale invasion of the eastern Mediterranean island, wishing for an inaugural conquest as he became Sultan in 1566. This was against the wishes of Grand Vizier Mehmed Sokolu Pasha, who couldn't prevent this incursion from happening. One sought after by the other Pashas, namely Mehmed Piale, but also Joseph Nasi, Duke of Naxos. Nicosia was at the heart of the Cypriot kingdom, yet it lacked the proper fortifications and strategic advantages that Famagusta had. As a result, when the Ottomans took over, it was a massive blow for the Venetians, who had to hope Famagusta would hold on until relief could be sent. A colossally difficult task that was, as part of the Ottoman Navy was tasked to prevent that from happening. So let us read the account of what had happened at the taking of Nicosia in Cyprus, as told by Fabriano Falchetti. Quote, I, Fabriano Falchetti, of Saluderio, a village in the district of Rimini, who happened to be at Nicosia in the company of Captain Palazzo da Fano, can give an account of many things which happened before and after the loss of that city. And I begin and say truly to your Serene Highness, how on the 28th of June the Turkish fleet arrived at the Salines. By common report, there were 200 vessels, galleys, galiots, fuste, and other kinds, such as lighters, caramusalini, palancate, and the like, to the number of 200 more. And as soon as they arrived, they sent off 100 other ships to Caramania to bring other troops, and landed some of their men, and built a few forts, and remained quiet 19 days. It was said, on account of a difference between the two Pashas, Piale wishing first to go to Famagusta, and Mustafa to Nicosia. They resolved, however, at last to go to Nicosia, which they reached in 6 days. When they were within 4 miles, they fell in with 500 stradiots, who were in ambush. These were the balance of the 800 in Famagusta, that is, there were 500 in Nicosia and 300 left in Famagusta. A great skirmish followed, and many were killed. 1 stradiot only fell, and Captain Cortese was made prisoner. We heard afterwards that they cut off his head. When they had pitched their camp about a mile from the city, 300 Italians made a sally and came to blows without any loss on our side. The enemy, posted behind a hill called Famagusta, began to build their forts, which were 5 in number, facing 5 of the city bastions. And while they were building them, many of their men were slain by our own artillery. When the forts were finished, they began to batter the city incessantly with their guns, and while still firing to make trenches, which ran from one bastion to another. Then they set to make other winding trenches, which sometimes came up to the walls of the city, and again another which girdled all 5 bastions, in which they posted many guns and musketeers, who fired continually and hindered us from approaching the walls, which were without parapets. Next, they brought up their works in serpentine fashion to our ditch, and there made 2 parapets, one on the right and the other on the left, and managed so that our artillery could not prevent them coming up to the angles of these bastions. And they did come up and cut off those angles. Meanwhile, our men made 2 sallies by night to find out what they were doing, not without loss on our side and theirs. On the Feast of the Virgin, August 15th, A sally was made to spike their guns, and a fierce skirmish ensued, in which many of the Turks were killed, and 40 of our men, among whom were Captain Giobattista da Fano, Count Alberto Scotto, and Captain Cesare da Treviso, lieutenant of the colonel. After this skirmish, no further sallies were made so as not to lose men. The Turks, meanwhile, set to joining the soil which they dug out of the bastions with other soil which they brought up in front of the ditch, and thus with fascines and earth they built up a road to the level of the bastions, while we could assail them only with fireworks and stones. Along this road, every day some of them kept suddenly mounting up, and always killed some of our men. When they were now fully furnished with everything necessary for the attack, they ceased firing and came to a parley demanding the surrender of the city. Report was duly made to the commanders and to the governor Rinconi, and it was determined to give no ear to their proposals, but to treat them as enemies. A few days later, on the morning of Saturday, September 9th, as reveille was sounded, they were already on the walls, having climbed up quietly in the night along the roads they had made without being discovered by our soldiers, attacked us so suddenly that we could offer little resistance to their first charge. But our troops retired to a shelter constructed by Captain Palazzo, where they met the enemy gallantly. And there the Turks would have got no further into the city had it not been that while we were fighting, there burst on our flank a great band of the enemy, who were understood to have entered by another bastion. They killed very many of our men, among whom were the commander, his brother, and Captain Palazzo. No resistance was possible, and one fled, another there. I got safe with 25 of my company to the square of the Salines, where was gathered a large band of nobles. We made a stand, and when the square was taken with great loss on our side, we retreated to the great square, where were the chiefs on horseback with the bishop and many others. Here we made a fresh stand, but lost ground and retreated to the palace of Signor Dandolo, where we found himself and the bishop. The gates were bolted, and when the Turks were for charging at them, we told them from the windows that we surrendered. They would not consent, but the lieutenant, Signor Dandolo, set free a Turk whom he had taken prisoner, and sent him to tell the Pasha that we surrendered with all our forces, and bid him order his men not to kill us. The Pasha sent a note to the Janissary, who was to take us prisoners. They set to killing and hailing us away, and in their onslaught Signor Dandolo was killed, and the bishop made prisoner with many others. I had been on the bastion Podocataro, where our standard bearer had lost his ensign, which I recovered. I was in all the fights mentioned above, and was the last made prisoner by a Turk, who led me to the pavilion, where 3 days later I was sold for 16 sequins to a renegade, carried me off to the fleet, and set me on a galley, where I lay chained for 20 days. End of quote. So with this primary source, this text, we can make a few key observations. First of all, Nicosia was a very important part of Venetian Cyprus. It was the heart of the kingdom. Whoever controlled this section of the island would be able to either defend or to continue a mounted assault on the rest of the domains, as the Ottomans did with Famagusta later. We get a sense that there was not enough of a garrison and personnel to defend this. Stradiotti, they were the mounted horsemen, like cavalry, I would say, that would have been sent on quick raids, either for scouting reasons or to do moderate damage to the opposition. They were very good units, but as stated in the text, 800 would have been not even 5% enough when we consider the fact that over 100,000 troops and auxiliaries were sent by the Ottomans to Cyprus. We also see the defenses of Nicosia, mainly the bastions, that they were lacking. They were not prepared enough. And in the next episode, where Sosomeno, an engineer at the Siege of Nicosia, explains a lot better how much more was needed, the state of the defenses of Cyprus, and all in all, the failure attributed, one can say, to Dandolo, and I've spoken about this in the previous episodes, but also to the Venetian Republic, who should have prepared better. It had all the decades, there were all the warnings. There was also the common knowledge that the Greek peasantry and lower classes were severely disgruntled, and there was severe unrest against the Venetian overlords and the Latin nobility. So given all these factors, for someone as experienced as Mustafa Pasha was, who had full control over the land troops in Cyprus, unlike the disagreements we saw at Malta in 1565, given how fractured the community of Nicosia was, and that city in all with precarious defenses and all of that, it was no surprise that Nicosia fell as easily, I would say relatively easy as it did, compared at least with what was a much more difficult challenge at Famagusta, much well fortified settlement with a lot more provisions, which could only be sieged from one side on land. Thank you for listening to this episode, which I find it to be a very interesting account, one of the most interesting ones in the 16th century section of Excerpta Cypria, and the one coming up next, the one of Sosomeno, the engineer, who was an engineer during the siege of Nicosia. It's a bit more technical, but it also completes the picture of what exactly happened in 1570 at Nicosia. Thanks again for listening. Do leave a like if you enjoyed this episode. Remember to subscribe if you haven't done so already. And until the next time, all the best.